Hello again and welcome back to the history of Bangalore. I am Ramji Chandran with episode 93 of season 2. When Hyder Ali had taken over Mysore as ruler in all but name, Bangalore and the wealthy kingdom of Mysore had come to the attention of the British. The British needed to acquire Mysore for their domination of the subcontinent to be complete. Over the next few episodes, I will talk about those fateful events of history that became milestones in the British achieving that goal. But before I get to the British, we need to close an earlier chapter, the Portuguese. They arrived a century before the British, and what they left behind is precisely the space into which the British were able to move. This episode is devoted to looking at what happened to the Portuguese. First, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, who make this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. The Portuguese arrived on the Malabar coast in 1498 when Vasco da Gama made landfall at Calicut. Within a decade, they had established a presence that was unlike anything the Indian Ocean had seen before. They didn't come only to trade on local terms, they came to control the terms on which anyone else could trade. The instrument they used for this was called the Cartaz. It was a pass system that required any vessel sailing in the Arabian Sea to carry a Portuguese Cartaz or Portuguese license. Ships without that Cartaz could be seized, their cargo confiscated, their crews killed, and sometimes the entire ship set on fire. It was, in essence, a tax on the ocean itself, and the Portuguese had the naval firepower to enforce it. For Vijayanagara, the Portuguese were not enemies, they were enablers. Their relationship was transactional and mutually beneficial. For example, Vijayanagara needed horses. The best horses came from Arabia and Persia, and they came by sea. The Portuguese controlled the sea, so therefore the Portuguese controlled the horse supply. And the horse supply was the single most significant item in the weapons trade of medieval South India. An army without cavalry was not an army, as much as a kingdom without horses was not a kingdom. Vijayanagara's rulers understood this dependency and cultivated the Portuguese accordingly instead of fighting them. In return, the Portuguese were permitted to establish their settlement at Goa in 1510 under Afonso de Albuquerque, and to extend their network of coastal factories, which means trading offices, and also forts all along the western seaboard. The relationship between Vijayanagara and the Portuguese held for over 50 years. Vijayanagara provided the inland buffer that kept the Deccan Sultanates away from the Portuguese coastal enclaves, and the Portuguese provided the maritime access that kept Vijayanagara armed, ready, and good to trade. And then came 1565 and Talikota. The fall of Vijayanagara at the Battle of Rakasagi-Tangadgi removed the protective buffer at one stroke. The Deccan Sultanates, Bijapur mainly, were now free to press towards the coast and right into the Portuguese, and they did so immediately. In 1570, just 5 years after Talikota, Bijapur laid siege to Goa. The siege almost succeeded. The Portuguese held, but barely. When the smoke cleared, they were confined to their 3 coastal enclaves, Goa, Daman, and Diu, and they could no longer project power inland. This was ironical, and the irony was precise. The Portuguese had built their Indian empire on the premise that maritime control equaled territorial power. For as long as Vijayanagara stood, they were able to get by with that premise. Vijayanagara's land power and Portuguese sea power were complementary. Together, they kept the Deccan Sultanates in check, and the Deccan Sultanates were common enemies of the both of them. Separated though, they were vulnerable. After Talikota, the Portuguese did attempt to adapt to the new circumstances. They seized the ports of Honavar, Basrur, and Bangalore and tried to extend their footprint into the Canara coast to control the pepper trade and secure supply lines to Goa. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. But the structural problem remained. Without a powerful inland ally, the Portuguese couldn't hold the ports. They couldn't hold on to territory. And then there was a second problem, and that was internal. The Estado da India, the Portuguese state in Asia, was slowly being strangled by its own administration. This was a process that historians called fiscalization, which was the conversion of every function of government into a revenue-generating exercise. This had corrupted the system from within. Governors had enriched themselves, supply lines were diverted. The feared Cartaz system, which once had been enforced with ruthless consistency, became a negotiating tool for individual Portuguese officers to profit from. The institution was hollowing out. And outside the official system, an entirely different Portuguese population was taking shape. The casados, the married settlers of the Portuguese, and the renegades, soldiers and adventurers who had gone beyond the reach of official Portuguese authority. They had spread deep into the interior. Some of them had converted to Islam and served in the armies of the Deccan Sultanates. Some had integrated so thoroughly into Indian society that their Portuguese identities were effectively lost. They had come to conquer. Many had simply become Indian. And now for a commercial break, and when I'm back, let's look at what happened to the Portuguese after this point, right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
The final blow to the Portuguese came not from the Deccan Sultanates, but from Northern Europe. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC as it was known, was younger than the Portuguese Estado and more capitalized, more disciplined, and utterly remorseless in competition. The Dutch had studied the Portuguese system with great care, and for many years, they understood the weaknesses. And in the first decades of the 17th century, they moved to dismantle it. The contest between them was fought across the Indian Ocean, in the Spice Islands, along the Malabar coast, at the approaches to Goa. The Portuguese, as we know, had built their empire on naval supremacy, and now the Dutch were able to challenge that supremacy with better ships, better organization, and much deeper financial reserves. By 1663, the Dutch attacked Goa directly. Then in the years between 1662 and 1666, in those 4 years, Cochin, Cananore, and the Portuguese settlements on the Malabar coast fell to the Dutch in rapid succession. The Portuguese, though, were not expelled entirely. They did manage to retain Goa, Daman, and Diu, or rather were allowed to. These are the 3 enclaves that they held right until 1961. But as a power capable of shaping events on the subcontinent, they were finished. The Arabian Sea was no longer a Portuguese lake. The Cartaz system was dead in the water, and the horse monopoly, a memory, a joke. Now, let's consider what this meant for the South and therefore Bengaluru. The Portuguese had been a structural presence in the political economy of the region for about a century and a half already. Now, their departure did not leave a vacuum. Instead, it left a set of questions. Who would control the western sea lanes? Who would regulate the movement of the goods between the coastal and the interior? And who would decide on which terms commerce was established? The Dutch answered some of those questions on the Malabar coast. But the Dutch were not interested in the interior. Their model was pretty much like the early Portuguese model. It was maritime. Control the sea, control the ports, extract profits, move on. The East India Company, and by this I mean the English East India Company, was keeping a close watch on all of this. It had slipped into Indian waters at the beginning of the 17th century. It was granted a charter by Queen Elizabeth in 1600, and given permission to establish a factory, or rather trading offices, at Surat by the Mughal Emperor Jahangir in 1615. The English watched the Dutch dismantle the Portuguese, and equally the English watched as the Mughal Empire began its long internal decline, and it watched the Deccan Sultanates fight each other to exhaustion, and it drew on its own predictable conclusions. The Portuguese had proved that a maritime power could dominate Asian trade. The Dutch had proved that the Portuguese model could be made better, but neither the Portuguese nor the Dutch had tried to do what the English East India Company was beginning to contemplate: moving inland into India, not just controlling the ports, but controlling the land behind the ports, not merely extracting the revenue from trade, but becoming the government itself. The rest of that history we know well, but I will address in the coming episodes. Now there is one more Portuguese thread worth pulling before I close this chapter, and that connects directly to the history of Bangalore, not through a battle or a treaty, but through a moment of moral calculation. When Hyder Ali had recaptured Bangalore after his West Coast campaigns, he found that the Portuguese merchants who were resident in the city, now these were men who had long enjoyed the hospitality of the Mysore Sultanate, had actively facilitated the British naval landing. They had concluded that the British were the stronger power and they are the ones to be friends with, and they acted accordingly. So Hyder summoned the head of the Portuguese factory and asked what he should do with the merchants. The head of that factory, with the instincts of a man who had chosen the winning side, suggested that they be executed. Hyder's response was a masterpiece of diplomatic theatre. He said, and these were his words actually, "I do not judge in that manner, for our laws are milder. Since they have made themselves English by engaging to serve them, their property shall be adjudged to belong to the Englishmen, and themselves to be thrown into prison till I make peace with that English nation." And in that one single sentence, Hyder Ali had avoided a diplomatic incident with Lisbon, justified the seizure of the merchants' considerable wealth, calling it enemy property, and demonstrated that the Portuguese, after a century and a half in India, were now so marginal to the politics of the South that they could be rebranded as English, and no one could seriously object. And that was the end of the Portuguese in the history of Bangalore, not with a battle, but with a sarcastic administrative ruling by Hyder Ali. The stage was now clear. The Portuguese were gone. The Dutch were confined to the coast. The Mughals were in decline. The Deccan Sultanates had exhausted themselves fighting with each other. And the English East India Company, patient, watching, capitalized, and in possession of a charter that gave it the right to make war, issue money, and govern the land, was preparing its moves. And that began the story of the East India Company and what it had to do with Bangalore. In my next episode, that's who I'm going to turn to, the English East India Company, and how a group of London merchants acquired the authority of a sovereign state, and how the road from a small factory on the Coromandel coast eventually led to the walls of the Bangalore Pete. That is coming up very soon. I am Ramji Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.